Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on Growing Without Irrigation by Amy Garrett of Oregon State Extension, Jacques Neukom of Neukom Farms, and Steve Peters of the Organic Seed Alliance and Seed Revolution Now. And also joining us today, which we didn't know that he was joining us, but he was part of the live presentation that was going on at OSU, is Bill Reynolds, who is a dry farmer and plant breeder. So this is your host, Alice Formiga from the eOrganic Community of Practice at eExtension. And you can find all eOrganic articles, videos, and our many upcoming and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at extension.org in the Organic Agriculture section. Before we start, I'd like to give you a very quick rundown of today's program. The presentation will last about 45 minutes, perhaps a few minutes longer because we have a lot of presenters, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for your questions. So today we have a group here at Oregon State University in a conference room, and they just presented a live talk, and they're going to be speaking again at the Small Farms Conference at OSU tomorrow, but they kindly agreed to present this as well online here for a national audience. So I'd like to thank the speakers for joining us today, and now I'm going to hand over the screen to our first presenter, who is Amy Garrett.
Hello, thank you for having us, and welcome to our, this is my first webinar, and I think most people in the room here. Let's see here. Yeah, my name is Amy Garrett, and I work with OSU Extension Small Farms, as Alice mentioned. This is the first part of a workshop series that's funded by Western SARE, the Growing Resilience Water Management Workshop Series. And we'll be having, like she said, these sessions at the Small Farm Conference tomorrow. Okay, so I'm just going to give you, joining with me today, I want to introduce these guys a little bit further. So Jacques Neukom, as Alice mentioned, he's from Neukom Family Farm, and they're known for their dry farm peaches and melons in Northern California. So he's been producing a variety of crops using dry farming techniques in a climate with long, dry, hot summers. Steve Peters, as she mentioned, is from Seed Revolution Now and Organic Seed Alliance. He's going to touch upon soil hydrological principles in dry farming, and then he and Bill Reynolds will be telling the story of the dark star zucchini and talk about the how seed saving can be a powerful tool for dry farmers. But before they talk, I'm going to tell you a bit about a brief intro to, I'm going to give you a brief intro to dry farming, tell you about some of the key management practices and techniques, and then tell you a bit about the OSU Small Farms Dry Farming Project. So where this dry farming project evolved from, one of the main questions, I've been in my position with Extension for about 5 years, and the most common question we get is, I just moved onto this piece of property and I'm trying to figure out what I can grow here. So we talk about soil type and water rights, and more often than not, these growers are on land without water rights. So then what are the cropping options? Climate change is also impacting growers more and more with reduced snowmelt, increased temperatures, and drought. And this past growing season, many growers I visited with have had their irrigation cut off early, some as early as June. So that was the earliest ever for many of them here in the valley. And projecting ahead, there's up to a 50% reduction in summer water availability in Oregon is predicted within the next 40 or 50 years. So dry farming management practices and strategies for growing with little or no irrigation will become more and more important as we move forward. All right, so then what is dry farming? So dry farming is referring to crop production during a dry season, just like our summers here in the Willamette Valley and Northern California and the Mediterranean, so a Mediterranean-like climate with usually like 4 or 5 months of dry summers. We're utilizing the residual moisture in the soil from the rainy season rather than relying on irrigation. And by the way, dry farming, as many of you probably know, is not a new way of farming. It's been around for millennia. Before the rise of dams and aquifer pumping, dry farming was a staple in much of the American West and Mediterranean. There are some resources out there on dry farming. Steve Solomon has talked about dry farming techniques in some of his books. Carol Deppy has mentioned dry farming and some of her writings, The Resilient Gardener being one of them. And dryland farming of grains has been written, there's a lot of information out there on dryland farming of grains, which is different than what we're talking about here today. But there's a lot of information out there on that. California Ag Water Stewardship Initiative has a great website with a dry farming page, lots of case studies. So those are some places you can go for more information. And then there's a lot of information from the early 1900s. So there's one there mentioned from John Widtsoe. And these are mentioned on our website as well, smallfarms.oregonstate.edu on the dry farming page. So the dry farming project to date has included some case studies. We've done case studies in Western Oregon and Northern California. We have done a demonstration here in Corvallis at the Oak Creek Center for Urban Horticulture. We've done side-by-side tastings of dry farmed and irrigated melons and tomatoes, have collected some preliminary yield data, and are pursuing grant funding to expand the demonstration project and do some participatory dry farming research with growers that are interested in dry farming. This is one of the first growers I visited with a few years ago, back in 2013, and she was on land. She had a few acres of water rights, but wasn't able to expand her irrigated crop production, so she was experimenting with tomatoes and squash under deep straw mulch. Then the following year, I ended up connecting with a retired dry farmer in Veneta, and he has 40 years of experience. So he's been growing a variety of crops for those 40 years, including tomatoes, potatoes, winter squash, and others. But he's on 9.6 acres, and in this article that I mentioned here on this slide from Small Farm News, we highlighted some of the common misconceptions and key points from his perspective about dry farming. A couple of them are dry farming is watering a few times in the beginning of the season and then cutting it off towards the end. And he says that watering is not complementary to dry farming. Watering can create crusting and cracking on the soil surface and cause the soil to dry out even faster. Dry farming, another common misconception is dry farming, it just means farming without irrigation, so doing everything as usual but just not watering. And there's a variety of practices that make dry farming work, and we're going to be talking a bit about those in a moment. And another farmer I visited with down in Lane County here in Oregon was growing dry beans for Hummingbird Wholesale, and he is using dry farming and irrigation as a tool to stagger his harvest. So he has the ability to irrigate, but is dry farming some of his beans, and those end up being the first harvested from his fields. So rather than have them all come out of the field at once, he's able to use dry farming as a tool that way. So how dry farming works, it really starts with the soil. Water holding capacity is key. Clay content and organic matter. For each 1% increase in soil organic matter, you can increase water storage in your soil by a lot. Also, a deep soil is important. Steve Solomon recommends at least 4 feet of soil or more. A nutrient-rich soil is important. This is happening a lot in like near rivers and floodplains where there's nice nutrient-rich deep soil. Site selection is also key. You can use plants as indicators. In late August, when we've had 3 months of hot, dry weather, looking around on your farm and looking where the plants are green or where the blackberries are especially plump and juicy, those might be indicators of what your soil's like underneath there. Here on the right side of the slide, there's a little snippet of the dry farmer in Veneta. He's farming on a Veneta loam. So there's a couple things to note here from this web soil survey snippet, and that is here in the typical profile area, you can see that below 14 inches there's clay content. So he's got good water holding capacity. And then down here a little lower, you can see depth to restrictive feature more than 80 inches. So that's more than 6 feet of soil that he has, his effective rooting zone. Crop and variety selection is also important, and our other speakers here are going to talk a bit more about that. Soil preparation, especially the timing, is key. Planting technique is also important whenever planting when and where there's moisture. That picture there on the right is showing you, well, that's more illustrating soil preparation timing, but it's dry on the surface there but moist just below, and you can kind of form it into a ball, and but it is dry on the surface. So increased Plant spacing is also important. Pre-soaking the seed can help with germination. Also, planting a little deeper. The dry farmers I visited with are planting a little bit deeper, so you're not putting that soil in that dry top inch or so. You're putting the seed down there, or the transplant, planting it down where the moisture is. And then pressing the soil in around the seed or transplant to create good seed-soil contact. And that's creating capillary action, wicking that moisture to the surface, and Steve's going to tell you a bit more about that in a few moments. So that top few inches is kept loose, and that's a dust mulch, and that's conserving that moisture down below. So that's the surface protection we're talking about. These are some of the crops that are dry farms, and you'll notice that lettuce and broccoli aren't on this list. Those are not commonly dry farmed. It's typically the crops you see here, and there are some exceptions to that list. I want to emphasize again the soil preparation and timing. This is a quote from the retired dry farmer in Veneta. The biggest mistake he sees Oregon farmers making when they attempt to dry farm is that they don't start working their ground at the right time. If they start when it's too wet, they'll never get the tilth right after that, and if they start when it's too dry, they'll never get the moisture back unless they're saved by late rains, which we didn't get last year. So that's a really key point. So in an attempt to take all this information I gathered from doing a little research and then visiting with all these growers that are, have dry farming experience, I attempted to apply this with a dry farming demo at the Oak Creek Center for Urban Horticulture. And this project was funded in part by a USDA NIFA grant, National Institute for Food and Agriculture. It was a Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program grant. So we had 3 plots there. We had a solanaceous plot with tomatoes and potatoes. We had 2 varieties of tomatoes, Mama Leones and Jory, and we had a Yukon Gold potato. By the way, all these varieties were selected based on interviews with dry farmers I visited with, so they're varieties that had been grown by people with dry farming experience. In the cucurbit plot, we had a variety of squash and melons, and we did a transplant and direct seed some to look at differences there. And then for the dry bean plot, we had 4 different varieties and 3 different planting densities. So here is a picture of the dry bean plot throughout the season, and it's important to note here, well, we had deer damage, so the top 30 to 50% of the plants were eaten, but I decided to still go ahead and thresh and clean the seed and see what we did have. So of the varieties that we selected, by the way, I don't have a handout here. I can't give you a handout, but there is on the Small Farms website, if you go to dry farming demonstration, just a little ways down on the page, you'll see summary and resource sheet for 2015 dry farming demo, and that handout outlines all of these things that I'm telling you about, and with a little bit more detail. So you can look at the yield that we got from those 3 different planting, or the 3 different planting densities and these 4 different varieties. But Whipple was the one that stood out as the highest yielding, and then that medium planting density was averaged across the varieties, was the highest yielding as well. For the squash and melons, we had the direct seeded and the transplanted, as you can see in that June 15th picture. On the right are the transplants. The direct seeds haven't come up yet. And you'll notice, like on the left, there's some gaps, and you can't see all of them in this photo, but we did have poor germination in a lot of the direct seeded crops, and they were direct seeded on May 25th, same day that the transplants were transplanted. So primarily the melons, we had Eel River, Escorial melon, and little baby flower watermelon. So they had poor germination in the direct seeds, and also the Zeppelin delicata had poor germination with the direct seeded, but pre-soaking the seed could have been helpful in mitigating that, so that might be something we try in this year's demos. Another thing to note on the watermelon, that watermelon pictured in the top right there is the little baby flower watermelon, and many growers have stopped growing that. It's an early maturing small variety, but it splits in irrigated conditions, and we didn't see any splitting in the dry farming plots, so that's important to note. The dark star zucchini, which Bill and Steve are going to be talking about a bit more, was definitely a standout crop. It didn't really wilt on the hottest days and cranked out zucchini from mid-July through September. The tomatoes and the potatoes, so we had the two varieties there, and the plant spacing in these plots was way too close, and there was a lot of blossom end rot in the first flush of the Mama Leones and the Jory tomato. So the second flush had a little less, but for the tomatoes, I'll be trying some varieties less susceptible to blossom end rot, like Early Girl and Big Beef have been suggested to me. So we'll try those next year and increase the spacing. For the potatoes, the Yukon Gold, they yielded about 4 pounds per plant, but they were pretty wide spacing, 2.5 foot in row and then 5 foot between row. So they, but yellowfin has been recommended to me by a grower in California, Paul Giantoli of Warren Creek Farms, gets much higher yield off of yellowfin. So we'll be adding that into our trials this year. We did have a dry farming field day on August 3rd, and we had more than 100 farmers and gardeners show up for that to visit with experienced dry farmers, see things in person, and do side-by-side taste comparisons of dry farm tomatoes and melons. And the dry farm tomatoes and melons were rated higher in the categories of texture, sweetness, and appearance. We did a follow-up field survey with them, and when they were asked why dry farming was of interest, their responses ranged from, I don't have water rights, my well ran dry this year, and other reasons were improved flavor, weed management, sustainability, and conservation of water, time, and energy. One of the things that really stood out to me, though, was that 93% of our attendees intended to apply what they learned at the field day on their land. So I was trying to think about how I could facilitate or harness that, and so for this year we're going to be expanding this demonstration into 3 locations in Oregon, in Aurora, Corvallis, and Central Point. We're going to be continuing with this Growing Resilience Water Management workshop series. And then for growers that are interested in trying dry farming out on their land, we're going to be initiating a participatory dry farming research project. So I encourage you to contact me if you're interested in learning more about that or hosting a trial. There's growers in Washington, California, and Oregon that are part of this project, and it's growing a little bit every week. If you're new to dry farming, I think it's just important to select a site with deep soil and good water holding characteristics to start, and if you can, select varieties that are from dry farm systems or are drought tolerant or early maturing, and then just start small and expand on your successes. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Steve here, and he's going to touch upon soil hydrological principles in dry farming.
Thanks, Amy. Before we get into more examples of dry farming, I'm just going to give you a brief science lesson, just covering the basic principle behind all of dry farming, and that's really the principle of capillary action. And it's a result of 2 forces that are happening, cohesive and adhesive forces. Cohesive are forces of attraction of like molecules, like water molecules are attracted to one another, and by themselves they really form a sphere. And adhesive forces are attractions between unlike molecules, and in this case, the diagram we're looking at with the 2 straws, if we look at this, the small diameter straw here, we'll see that the adhesive force between the surface of the straw and the water is actually pulling the water up. And because it's a narrow straw, a large percentage of the surface area of the water is in contact with the straw. On the other hand, the wide straw on the left, there is a little bit of an attraction. You can see the curved meniscus surface here where you get an attraction, an adhesive attraction. However, because it's a wide straw, most of the water is overcome by the forces of gravity, so it doesn't rise very far. And the other principle that's key here is the pressure gradient difference. So we're moving from a high pressure where the water is to lower and lower pressures as the water moves up. And here's a diagram of a stylized diagram of two soil profiles. The one on the left, large particles, we'd consider this a sand, and it's much like that fat straw on the previous slide where there's not a lot of surface where water is touching the particles, and hence the water doesn't rise very far above the water table. I mean, there might be a slight bit of capillary action, but really this is not a soil we would recommend you practice dry farming. The soil on the right, in contrast, is a much finer textured soil, and this could include clays or sandy silt loams. And these soils have excellent capillarity, and including worm castings and worm trails, like this worm illustrated here in the picture, where you get some nice capillary movement of water up. So think of dry farming, it's really the reverse of kind of our normal thinking about water always coming from above with drip irrigation or overhead irrigation or flood irrigation or rain. We're talking about something exactly the opposite, water that's moving upward in an upward direction, and that's what really dry farming is. This also illustrates the dust mulch that Amy mentioned at the top. This 3-inch layer that basically the capillaries have been broken here by tillage. So what happens is that it retains the moisture below the dust mulch, because if you didn't have this dust mulch, you'd still be losing a lot of moisture to the atmosphere. And this is just a shot illustrating the progression of a squash plant through the season, and this blue water line is really meant to be sort of that fluctuating semi-saturated zone. The water table could be many feet below this, but there's this zone in which capillarity happens, and during and over the season, progressively that zone, the top of that zone layer, very likely gets lower and lower because we don't have any rain for 4 or 5 months. But as that surface is getting progressively lower, the roots are getting much larger too. So and not only in this this two-dimensional rendering, but really it's about the three-dimensional root mass, and particularly this more mature zucchini squash on the right. Those roots extend way out beyond the zucchini, perhaps 4 or 5 times a larger diameter than the above ground portion. But the point is that the plant, a good, well-suited dry farm plant, has a strong taproot, and it's basically chasing the water as it gradually moves downward. And for a good tool to use when you want to learn about what kind of soil you have to see if it's appropriate is simply a one-piece regular soil auger, and this one goes down to 4 feet. And the nice thing about it has a little auger at the tip, so you rotate the auger to get your soil core, and you get these little 6-inch soil core chunks, and as I said, you can go down to 4 feet with this, and then you can really determine your texture as well as look at your soil moisture at the same time. And it's a reasonable cost as well. So I'd recommend for anybody who is looking at land to consider for dry farming, this is a good tool.
So this is Jacques Neukom, and I'm with Neukom Family Farms. This is an aerial view of our orchard, which is just part of our farm. There's actually, I live back here. This is my orchard, which is entirely dry farmed. It was very hard to think of taking this picture, any picture, that would really give you the idea, but this orchard is actually on a knoll. The transition from the riverbed to the first floodplain is actually a 120-foot cliff. And then you actually go up several more floodplains by the time you get to the orchard. So when you start thinking, oh, it's got to be the perfect location to dry farm, it's not true. None of my locations are perfect. Now this is, once again, this is way back in here. This is where I live in the orchard. This down here is our row crop area. This is what no orchardist wants to see when your peaches are in full bloom, but it does happen from time to time. This is basically just showing, this is a picture of the orchard. This is where I'm going to start the talk. I'll move into the row crops later. A cover crop growing, early spring. At this point, I'm just trying to grow the tallest cover crop I can, get the most organic matter back into that soil. As the season stretches on, you can see I've started to work my cover crop in. This is a really good slide. If you look at these are all different rootstocks. The first rootstock here, I think, is a citation. It is, the way this rootstock is made is it's cloned. There's several different ways they can do this, but this is basically a clone from a master rootstock. This is a Lavelle, and I know one of these two is also a St. Julian, which is also a cloned rootstock. I exclusively go with the Lavelle rootstock. It is actually started from seed, and you can see that strong tap-rooted nature. It's very, very helpful. This is something I always like to look back at. When you think of grapes and the best wine, a lot of people think of French wine. And there's laws in many parts of France where you're not allowed to water your grapes at all. If you truly want a superior product, it's dry farming. And this is what a happy vintner looks like when he gets his dry farmed grapes. This is a wonderful farmer in the Hoopaw Valley, Grady Walker. This is the orchard once again, putting the cover crop in. I grind the wood with a mulching grinder, let the chickens go through. That's adding, even the clippings go back into the soil. This is a new orchard, about 160 trees, peaches and pluots. And the reason this slide is in here is look how small I've cut these trees. These are from Dave Wilson. These are from Fowler's. This is a tree that you would find bare root in the springtime at any garden center. And this is starting out dry farming. You go from the very beginning. So these trees, they might have a 6-inch trunk. What that accomplishes is it makes, from the very beginning, the roots are bigger than the aerial portion. These trees are now 3 years old today, and we haven't lost a single one. This, once again, is to illustrate, this is an Asian pear that I've cut all the way down. This is maybe an 8-inch tree. This is putting in, this is just too pretty a picture not to include. It's Asian pears and peaches and getting that cover crop in. Basically, I'm establishing that dust mulch. Very simple tools, an old tractor, 53 Ferguson and a disc. This is, part of the situation with the trees is, annual pruning and annual thinning, okay? You will get regular crops, you will get good-sized fruit, and you will have, your trees will not be stressed. This is, we snip, we use snips or scissors to cut the Asian pears off, so the ones that are left aren't blemished. Heavy thinning, but we also get a heavy crop because of it. Okay, now into the row crops. This is me, the tool on the back of the tractor. I just have some really basic rippers. In this instance, I'm planting carrots. I'm going maybe 18 inches down. I'm exposing that moisture. I'm giving, because we're dry farming, I'm giving the carrots a very easy avenue to go straight down. This is how I prep beds. I start in the spring once I've gotten my cover crop under control. I put in, this is a chicken manure rice hull compost. This is, me and one worker. You can, the important picture here is the tool on the back of the tractor. I have cultivators behind the tires. I also have a shank right down the middle. It helps incorporate the manure, because that's all we're doing. We're throwing manure right down the furrow. And then in the very end of the toolbar, I have closing discs that we'll see in the next slide. Basically, I'm moving from my left to my right. Off the front of the tractor, we're throwing manure into the furrow. Back of the tractor, I'm incorporating and then closing the furrow, making it into a nice long mound the length of the field. Everything to my left, I've already done. It's been manured. It's waiting. Everything to my right still needs to be manured and mounded. This is a field. Now, this could happen in April, depending on the year, May. But the neat thing about having these mounds is if you can envision in the center of that mound, you've got your fertility and you've got moist soil. So it's incorporating. And when you're ready to plant your crop, what I do is I will come through, I will rototill my seed bed and then plant it out. So what you're looking at here is actually two adjoining fields. Each of our fields are 150 by 150 square. And it's two fields. This one right in front of us is just planted in melons. Here's the melons germinating. And once again, just 2 inches underground, you're going to find moisture, but no weeds. When we hoe this crop, we pretty much hoe it once. That's also when we thin to 1 foot. The tractor width is about 5 feet, so you've got rows 5 feet apart, plants 1 foot. I find that works great. This is an example of a melon patch, once again, totally, completely canopy closure. Vigorous, healthy, so healthy that it's actually, if you look at the Alice Chalmers there, there's melons climbing up the tractor. This is at the end of the season. This is actually a field that I left those mounds until July 4th. Then I came in, rototilled them down. There was still moisture there, and that's when I planted this crop. So this is into October. I make my workers take their shoes off when they're bare feet so they don't snap any of the vines as they continue to produce fruit. And we have to throw them out of the patch. So we form a chain gang, and each person throws a melon to the next to the side of the field. This is all without water. And this is a climate. The climate I'm in is one where we get 100-degree temperatures June, July, and August. It's a very hot climate, and this is not your ideal soil. This is not your ideal circumstance, but we can do this. And also another benefit of the dry farming is if you look at these are all old varieties. And a lot of the old varieties have very thin skin. They're very prone to cracking if you water them. I don't have that problem. I also have found that I don't have wireworms that come up through the moist soil into the bottom of my melons, rendering my melons unsellable and rotting. So I get an incredibly high percentage of pack out from my melon patch, and the flavor is unbelievable. I mean, there's lots of reasons why to dry farm. There's the less weeds, less labor, superior quality, taste. There's also all the water that is not being used stays in the creek. This is a 15-acre farm. We use less water on a 15-acre farm than the average homeowner in our community. All the water that goes onto this farm is actually on residential rates from the community water system. So if I did use water, it would be high. The cost would be high. But the beautiful thing is I don't need to use water. This is a happy employee, and I've shown you happy vintners, happy employees, but the big thing is happy customers. We sell 100% of our produce within 55 miles of the farm. In the last 21 years, I've gone from doing 5 farmers markets and I don't know how many supermarkets to 2 supermarkets, 2 farmers markets, and I sell just more and more produce. So these are some other adaptations to dealing with less water or no water. This is a 30% shade cloth that we use on our tomatoes. A lot of times, as the season goes on, plants do wilt. They do look tough. Something like this can help you still get that superior quality of a dry farmed product, but take off maybe some of the sunburn or some of the intense heat. Here's the same on trellised tomatoes. Also with these, these aren't dry farms, but we figured out that we use 6 gallons of water for a 150-foot row of tomatoes. That's a week. That's, you know, almost nothing. Also, another good attribute of dry farming is sometimes the fruit is a little smaller. And this, in today's market, you want your produce, especially things like squash that are so easy to dry farm, you want them a little smaller. You want a personal serving or family serving. You don't need to feed many families of 14 for a month off of one squash. Dry farming does a really good job of that. Just a little something different is, you know, always experiment. So this is some experiments with living mulch on a smaller orchard. This is Asian pears, pluots. I found that the peaches don't like the living mulch at all, but the pluots, pears, plums, apples, they do fine. So this is a lamb's ear that eventually, I started it around each tree. I eventually brought it to the whole understory. This is a few years later. Feverfew, iris, comfrey, you know, there's so many things that are great for beneficial insects, toads, frogs, you know, that don't take water. All these things do very well in a Mediterranean climate. And this, of course, is the ultimate of what I'm looking for, and that's, you know, product accessibility. This is just a standard kid at the farmer's market who loves his dry farmed pluots.
All right, back to Steve Peters again, and Bill Reynolds with me here. Now this photo here is a shot of Bill's farm. He farms along the Eel River in Humboldt County. He's about 20 miles in from the ocean. So he's got a climate that's not as extreme as Jacques. His daytime highs are typically 85, maybe gets a 90-degree day, but not so much. But he also gets those cool nights, which is really, really important for this whole system to work. And there's the dark star zucchini, which we're going to be talking about here. And I'll just a little more background. I was the seed production manager at Seeds of Change for 15 years, and so Bill was one of my key growers, and I've worked with him for almost 20 years. And when I first met him, he was on the quest for a better zucchini squash that he could dry farm. And we also brought John Navazio, who at the time was the research director at Organic Seed Alliance, in on this project. But before we talk about the actual breeding, we just want to illustrate a couple of different things about dry farming that are the key elements. And the first one is about the dust mulch, and I'm going to let Bill describe this a little bit. You might want to come up here, Bill.
This shot shows the moisture coming up, and shows you the tilth of the soil and the fine grain, and the capillary action is this moisture coming up. And it's also a way of describing its percolation. And the fine tilth, the fine soil warms up a lot more than something with clods. So a fine seed bed is key to dry farming, and that's what causes the percolation, is the difference between the daytime temperature and the nighttime temperature of the soil. And this is just a good shot of that. And you notice there aren't a lot of clods in this picture. You know, they're, peas and pea-sized, and nothing as big as a marble, really.
Not little.
And yeah, and what happens with a large clods is they keep that soil from getting the solaring up and the temperature getting higher, which is what causes the percolation, brings the moisture at night. So that's a good shot of that. And These are winter squash and zucchini. The rows are 12 feet apart. You can see that these plants have grown into touching each other, and the wide spacing keeps that percolation going by, when it's flat and fine particles, it heats up and the moisture comes up, and it's almost like irrigating. And you can cultivate. These plants are too big to cultivate right now because of the root system. And one thing in dry farming that you absolutely don't want to do is to cut the roots. That just takes that you have dramatic bad effects if you get in there and cultivate the roots. So there's a time to do it, and before they get too big like this, they really like cultivation just outside of the root zone, and that puts air in the soil, and that place where the air is when the moisture comes at night, it fills up those spaces with like a ground fog, or it's also known as tule fog, but you'll see it, and it's the dew rising out of the ground through those pockets of air. So cultivating is key, and I maybe cultivate 20 or more times. And then this was the big drought year in California, and it was one of the best dry farming years I'd had for seed production. This is ridiculous. That's one plant with, 6 mature zucchini on it, and the plants are they're still putting out a squash that you could eat. And along with all that, because of the drought season, the drought that we had, it also had a lot of clear starry nights and warm and hot days, and that's what brings the moisture and allows a plant to produce a crop this size. And there's the trailer full. There's a lot of seed that came out of there. That's out of 2 rows that were 600 feet long, and it was just
2,500 fruits.
Yeah, 2,500 fruits. Steve just told me that because he picked them up and lined them up there, and yep, it's quite a job. There we are. This is a sluice box. It's very similar to a gold sluice box, and we're running the zucchini seed down that. Saving your own seed is super important in this because they're already genetically programmed to grow roots. And that's what we're doing in dry farming, and it kind of changes your thing. You look at the top of the plant and you see the fruit and that, but what we're actually doing is growing and strains that are adapted to growing large roots, so they can make a plant with a limited amount of water because they've got the roots.
Great. So now we're getting into the breeding part of it, because this is, yeah, thanks, Bill. And so these were Bill's wishes. He wanted the perfect zucchini, and all these different traits would really be very desirable for a commercial grower, including the dark green, the dark glossy fruits, faceted, open canopy, bush habit, spinelessness, sustained yield, and particularly vigorous plants that are going to be productive in dry farm conditions. So what Bill did initially in 1998, Raven was his favored hybrid zucchini, which had a lot of those very fine horticultural traits, the dark green shiny fruit, high lutein levels, which is a phytonutrient. It gives the flesh a little bit of a buttery cast, yellow buttery cast, the open canopy. But it was a very low plant vigor and a real short harvest window. So you had to turn the crop up to get another crop in to sustain your yield through the season. Well, he crossed that with Black Beauty, which is an old heirloom, which is super vigorous. And you can see all the traits that go along with that. Not many of them not exactly desirable for a commercial squash, but the key thing was this has a root system that won't quit. And when we combined the two, we got some pretty amazing results. And so first, Bill started by just doing mass selection for 4 years. He let them all cross, and then the plants, the resulting plants, the next year he planted out, and he'd choose the best ones and then save the seed from those. Well, we got a little progress, but really, and in fact, we ended up, after 4 years, producing something called Black Eel, which is an OP variety that we offered at Seeds of Change, which looked like this. However, there was still a lot of flaws. There were still many plants that were vining, and they didn't have quite the complete open canopy. So then we brought John Navazio in to help us to really concentrate, to really dial in on getting the best plants. So we had to employ the technique of self-pollination. So the very best plants in the field were, Bill went through and self-pollinated the very best ones, and he did this for several generations. So what he'd do is he'd self the plant, a male and female flower, and then he'd bag them up. He'd taped them. Yeah, he would tape the flowers, and so then they develop into a mature fruit. And then the next year he would keep each cross in a separate bag. So that first year he had 26 successful selfs. So he planted out 26 rows the following year of roughly 25 to 30 plants in each row. And so then he had a criteria where at least 2/3 of the plants in that one row had to be good to keep the row. And if less than 2/3 were good, he eliminated the entire row. If more than 2/3 were good, he kept the individuals that were good and just rogued the rest of the individuals, and then he allowed the rest of the field to intermate at the end. And he did it for 4 years, and by 2006 we had Dark Star. So and really has all the characteristics that we desired initially. So then Bill, and here's our signature star, which is it's a Dark Star when it gets to this point and when it's a mature fruit. And then Bill was friends with a commercial grower down in Baja, and we took it down there, took the Dark Star down there, and as you can see, it yielded fruit for a month and a half longer than all the leading hybrids, had less cucumber mosaic virus and powdery mildew, a little more variable than the F1s in terms of fruit type, but higher yield. And then this is, I want Bill to say something about this. This is
well, this is a picture of at least a 50-acre block, and we would grow the seed that we would grow from one season. We would grow in the winter in Baja, and then I'd select which lines produced the best, and so I grew two crops per year by doing them in Mexico location. But we grew a lot of zucchini, you can see in that picture, and the fact that dry farming and organic production and plant breeding, traditional plant breeding, was far superior to what was available. So you can do it.
And so one of the other things, and so Bill kept sending seed to Sam and working with him, and finally, well, did it for 4 years, and the most radical result was in 2010 and early 2011. There was a couple of very unusual frosts in the Baja. Temperatures dipped below 30 degrees and wiped out every zucchini in their fields, several big 50-acre and larger fields. But Dark Star was the only one that actually bounced back. It was beaten down, but it came back, and for over a month it was the only zucchini that was producing food, only zucchini that was producing in the month of February when we sent stuff to Whole Foods. So in summary here, when we're talking about a breeding strategy for crop suitable for dry farming, the number one thing, when you can't be afraid to kill a few plants along the way. You really can't, you don't want to be coddling the plants. You want to expose them to all the harsh conditions that they're going to have to get used to. And that way you can identify the strong individuals. Start with a large enough population that you can be really severe with your roguing, and you can also have a chance to see maybe some individuals that are even better than the general population. Start your mass selection process, start a mass selection process for minor improvements of existing varieties, but if you want to do a new variety, then you need to make a strain cross to start establishing a breeding population. And then continue your mass selecting, or go to the progeny selection if you get to that level. And then finally, make sure that you validate your progress by comparing your different lots of seed from the different years. So that way you'll know if you've actually succeeded in your breeding efforts.
I think we're finished, so we could take some questions there.
Okay, thank you. That was a great presentation with so many wonderful pictures. So it's so great to have some farmers online with us as well. It really adds to the presentation. So this looks, yeah, Amy has added the contact information of small farms, and I'll leave that slide up. And then after that, I'll move on to the slide of our archive. So I know we've been getting a lot of questions already during the webinar, and several of them have asked if you could go into a little bit more detail on your dust mulch and how you create that. People want to know whether you just wade and the water evaporates off the surface, or how much you till. If you could just talk about that more, that'd be great.
I can start with that a little bit, and part of it is just in the orchard. I know I cultivate under the cover crop, and I'm really sensitive to when the last rain is, because that piece of ground being on a knoll dries out super quick. And I know I've failed as a farmer if I see dust behind my tractor. So I try and cultivate that ground to create the dust mulch, loose soil on top. And then when I've done that, I actually don't go into the orchard for several weeks. And what I am allowing is that top few inches to dry out. If I did go in, or even when the neighbor's dog gets in and runs around, everywhere that dog steps is where weeds germinate. And if you're dry farming, in my conditions, it's either at that point those weeds, fortunately in the orchard the weeds don't really matter that much or at all really. But in other situations that's a hand hoe. And on the crop side, on the row crop side, after putting your fertility in, it's always smart to wait about 2 weeks so that it incorporates. And something we were talking about as a group earlier was this: there's a phrase called nature abhors a vacuum. And what that means is that if you light a match, the smoke is concentrated, but then it dissipates because it's trying to reach equilibrium in the solution, which is the air. Well, the same is true with the fertility in your soil, and the same is true with the water in your soil. And it's one of the reasons why dry farming works, is this concept that nature abhors a vacuum. So what you want to do with you wait 2 weeks, and then, do your bed prep. Even if you do your bed prep quickly afterwards, you might have some, fertility residue, but you can do that, and that soil should, because it's soft and fluffy, the top will dry out, but if you run any seeder, whether it's an Earthway or a Jang or a Haas or a Planet Junior, that seeder is made to plant the soil or plant the seed, an inch or so underground, and then firm the soil down. And that's that you're compacting the soil right where the seed is, which is allowing that capillary action and that compression. Seeds innately know when the environment is right to germinate. And if you're planting that seed in the moist soil, compacting it so it's actually in contact with that moist soil, that's 99% of dry farming right there. And that's a lot of that becomes intuitive, I would say. And the beautiful thing is, maybe other than thinning out a thick stand of new starts, that's the next labor is harvest.
Well, Jacques, you said, timing is everything on this, and we're trying to work our ground up when the moisture from the last rain is just right to allow our tools with our tractor to make those fine particles instead of actually when clods break. One thing, if you've got clods out in your field, you can see when they first begin to dry out, they'll be dry along the outer part of the clod, but the inside, about the size of a quarter, will still be damp. That's the ideal time to work your ground. But it's very hard to predict whether this is going to be the last rain or not. But you just keep on working it. If it rains, you let it dry out to the perfect moisture content, you work it again. And one of the times it's going to be the last rain. We don't know when that's going to be, but that's how you make your seed bed and cause that percolation.
Cultivating it or working your ground, that's really you preserving your bank account of water that's under your field.
Right.
And it works on a field basis. It's really hard or impossible to dry farm on a smaller scale. It's when it really starts to work. We all, as farmers, you probably know, like the edge effect. You never quite get the biggest ears of corn right along the edge, or the prettiest tomatoes right along the edge, and that's true for dry farming as well. So you're going to want to, the bigger the field, the better. And I work on a 120 by 120 square, and that's more than big enough. So.
And of course, there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Yeah.
And Bill uses a tool that he learned from an old dry farmer named Bear Jones about how to break down clods, because he has some issues with clods in his field. So he uses a homemade tool, a scrub, which is a tool that breaks down the clods. Jacques doesn't use it, but again, every farm is different, and you've got to figure out what tools are going to work for you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was great, and we have another sort of common theme that runs through a lot of questions is whether you've looked at no-till versus tillage in dry farming, or whether you've combined dry farming with no-till or reduced tillage. I don't know if that one's for Amy or whoever wants to step in and answer that.
I can answer a little. Yeah, I've looked into a lot of that, and I'm super interested in no-till, and but the one thing that happens with no-till is your soil becomes more massive. And then the wicking action of that surface, if you can imagine a field, there's very few fields in Northern California or any Mediterranean environment that stay green, and part of that is that that dust mulch that we're talking about. And I tried many different ways to try a no-till dry farm, and I saw my trees suffer, I saw my plants suffer. And that doesn't mean you can't do it, but I could never figure it out. And that's why I went for the living mulch with the lamb's ear and the comfrey and different things like that, and that works better. And I'm basically, the way I look at it as those plants are growing my mulch. They're putting down. I originally started off with throwing out wood chips on 60 trees and woodsy mulch, and I quickly realized after several years you can't find enough wood chips, and they're a valuable commodity, and so that's when I started in on the living mulch, and that's worked for me. Like I said, it didn't work on the peaches, but I'm still experimenting, and there's some great farmers doing very close to no-till, but you have to be in the right circumstance. Yeah, it's very different.
No-till is not dry farming.
Yeah, and I love to look at every drop of water that I use comes out of a local creek, and there's coho in that creek, and there's steelhead and chinook, and it's very tangible to me as a farmer what the consequences of my production are. And so in my situation, I really feel like, we talk a lot as farmers about limiting nutrients and whatnot. Well, I think one of the limiting factors is water. I live in Humboldt County. That's, classified as a rainforest some years, but 6 months of the year, it's a desert. And that's the 6 months of the year. It's very important that water stays in the creek. So I'm just doing my part with that. And the dry farming is huge. It is so, I use so little water on my farm, and the product, the superiority of the product. And as far as I've been doing this 21 years, and I totally understand. And I'm going at the end of February. I'm going to an Elaine Ingham 1-week intensive on soil microbiology, and I'm paying attention. I'm one of those farmers that's really trying, and that's a hard one. That's a really hard one.
I will say no-till, the thing about no-till, and if you leave a lot of surface mulch particularly, you lose the pressure gradient. I mean, you don't have the pressure, so you're not, you basically, the capillary action doesn't happen. And so you actually get a dried out zone down below.
No-till in that way is no air, which is just, it's the most important thing in dry farming. You have to have air. And if you don't till, you can grow some crops no-till, but not row crops and vegetable crops and the crops we were showing, tomatoes and melons. You can't grow those no-till.
And another thing is, people go, oh, well, that's a lot of tillage. You're moving a lot of energy. But actually, surface tillage is low energy. It's not like you're not putting a ripper blade through there, which you would in no-till. You actually require much less tractor power.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many angles that no-till is a positive thing, and someday I'm working to it. I hope someday, but when I think about like the diesel fuel I use on my farm, it's probably under 50 gallons a year, and so.
And a lot of the work I think you all mentioned is happening up front. Well, there's a lot of tillage happening early, but in the middle of the summer, there's not tractors running through the field cultivating weeds because there's really not a lot of weeds.
Now you have to, if you irrigate, you have to cultivate after you irrigate. Every time you irrigate, then you have to cultivate to keep that air in the soil. And if you don't irrigate, if you don't water, you don't need to water. If you water, you need to water. There we go. Figure that one out.
Yeah, well, there's a question that's kind of like that. Somebody wanted to know if dry farming an all or nothing thing, or can you water once a month? And this person is guessing that will confuse the roots.
Yeah, no, you gotta. It's all or nothing. And one thing I see with if you train your plants that the water is up on the surface, They love that because that's where all the fertility and nutrients is. It's up at that top layer, and they love it, but it also means that every time you go through a temperature fluctuation, they feel it. So if you go through a heat wave, those roots are baking. And when the soil dries out, those roots are suffering. Okay, now when you're dry farming and the roots go down, the soil temperature stays the same. The water percentage saturation goes down very slowly, and that a plant can predict, oh, I need to flower now, or I'm not going to make seed. Oh, I need to stop growing so big because I don't have enough water. I mean, the plant understands these things. It's
the one thing I did see Ed Cohen at Earthly Edibles down there in Northern California. He was watering his tomatoes in initially, but then not watering at all after that. So he would dig a hole, fill it up with water, let that sink into the soil, and then he would plant his tomato and then not water after that. But that's so.
Yeah. So initial establishment, but then let it go from there.
Well, I bare root my tomatoes, purposely knock all the soil off of them and put them with no irrigation because it bakes around there and makes a crust that reflects the heat. And no, it's a commitment. If you're going to dry farm, you can't dry farm and irrigate because they don't work together.
Okay, we have a question about how Jacques seeded his carrot bed.
Yeah, I use for my carrots. I hate this tool, but and I throw it pretty much every time I do. I just hate even saying the name of it, but I use my Earthway seeder, and that's what always works great for me. But like I said, I hate recommending it to anyone. I do not have a Jang or some of the other ones that have come out in the last couple of years. I'm starting to experiment with a Haas seeder, and I think I'll try that next year. But yeah, I do those 2 rips. I used to do 3 per bed, and I could dry farm 3 rows per bed. But I was finding I was digging them with a fork, and I was the center row I was breaking a lot. Another thing that's really amazing is if you plant them late, like July, and you let them grow on their own until and you get the first rain in like October, you can actually pull them out by hand. You can pull out an 18-inch root by hand when there's that extra water. And I always wait about if you wait that long with the dry farmed carrot. Before the rain, they will be a little bitter. But if you wait 2 weeks after that rain, there's nothing better than a carrot grown that way.
And Jacques, you're running your seeder directly over that rip line.
Directly over that rip line, yeah. So that the plant can go straight down. And I tried it without that rip line, and I got the funniest looking carrots you can imagine. You just never. It was like I was pouring molten metal down a rabbit hole or something. Crazy.
Okay, this is a quick question for Amy. What was the name of the potato again that you were using? Was it Yellowfin?
The one that we had last year in the demo was Yukon Gold, but Yellowfin is the one that has been higher yielding for other farmers that specialize in potatoes.
Okay, great.
Dry farm potatoes. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question about whether using straw mulch would be good instead of dust mulch.
So the straw mulch, the grower that I visited with, I showed early in the presentation that was experimenting with the deep straw. She was seeing a lot of pest problems, I think, in her field, and the soil temperature is really cool. So that's the one thing I think that with the straw mulch is you have much cooler soil temperatures. So things like that require warm soil temperatures to germinate or to grow well or may suffer that way. But there's also you're not breaking that capillarity. So I've only seen one farmer experimenting with that. The other people dry farming commercially are not using straw mulch because this other method is very effective.
Okay.
And again, you lose the same kind of pressure gradient too with straw mulch, so you don't get that capillary movement.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that's really beautiful about the no irrigation is, every time you irrigate, you're burning a certain percentage of the organic matter in your soil. And with dry farming, I feel like I'm getting a whole season of growing a superior quality product, and I'm not burning up any of that organic matter. I'm also not watering, leaching anything away. It's all still there, and you see it, as soon as your cover crop comes up. It's very thankful to have all that still there. You didn't burn through it all.
Okay, here's one more question for Jacques here. How does he keep his bed centers lined up in his annual vegetables so that he knows he's planting into the compost that he buried under the furrows?
It's mainly it's all about the toolbar on the back of the tractor, making sure that's totally aligned, and it's usually why I'm the one up on the tractor, but I also do like the physicality of throwing the manure. But making sure that you're putting that coulter right down the furrow, incorporating the manure, and then those discs are closing your furrow to create that nice mound.
You follow your wheel tracks.
Yeah, I follow my wheel tracks, and I just make sure I'm right on top of it. Then when I come back over it, sometimes I use a rototiller to smooth out a seed bed. Sometimes I use my disc that works. If there's moisture in the soil still, so early on, usually I use my disc because it's easy. But later, if maybe there's some larger clods, the rototiller will break those up better than the disc will.
Okay, here's a question maybe for Amy or Steve. Do you know if there are any public plant breeders in the Pacific Northwest region that work with producers on organic OP breeding for these type of systems? I know here at OSU, Jim Myers works on organic breeding, but I'm not sure if he works on dry farming varieties. Amy, do you know if anybody is doing that?
Yeah, I know that Jim did have a grad student a few years back that crossed a bean with a tepary bean. So it was more drought resistant, had some drought resistant qualities. But I don't know of any plant breeders, and Steve might.
Yeah, I don't know of anyone here either. Yeah. It's mostly been farmers.
Yeah.
Taking up the cause.
Mm-hmm.
I've been going to the Ecological Farming Conference and Brighton Bush Farmer to Farmer Exchange, and a lot of gatherings in the Organic Seed Alliance, and for years now I've always been amazed that I haven't seen dry farming on the list of talks, and it's kind of intimidating to be talking right now about it, but somebody's got to do it, and the fact that I'm making a living at it, and that Bill's creating these superior varieties of vegetables using this technique, I think it says something.
Yeah, and I invited these guys in the room here now because they are, like, when you look out for, you start trying to source dry farm seed or find farmers that are dry farming, there's only a handful. And for seed sources, Seed Revolution now and the work that Bill's doing, there's not really much else out there that I can find at this point.
You shouldn't be scared at all about, like, well, if I can't find dry farm seed and that's what I need to start, well, I'm not going to start. Most of the seed on our farm, other than peas and carrots, are produced on farm, and I've seen dramatic, and also starting off with store-bought seed or it still works. But the neat thing is when you see it the second year that you've saved your own seed, and the third year you've saved your own seed, and the 20th year you've saved your own seed, it just gets better and better and better. And I grew a watermelon that was, the first year I grew it, I only had a few watermelon that could handle the dry farming. Well, I saved those seeds, and within 1 year I had a crop of watermelon, and it can respond that quickly.
And I think, you know, you start out by screening a lot of varieties maybe that you have potential. And of course, you may not know what those are, and you may need to go to people that perhaps know a little more. But I think one of the things is that vigorous growth, the underground, what the root systems are doing, because that is really the, you know, sort of the key to the success here. And as Jacques said, once you have varieties that can handle dry farming even a little bit, then you can just elevate it to the next level.
Yeah, and there are, you know, like Southern Oregon is a hotbed of seed growing, and, you know, people like Don Tipping and so many others are real leaders. Like, they're really, we're all learning stuff from Southern Oregon. So they're out there, and the biggest thing is just, you know, talk and try it, experiment.
We're running a little low on time, so I know there are a couple people that have typed in questions asking for where they can find more information on dry farming, and then also someone was interested in knowing where they might be able to find information that supports the forecast for drier conditions in future years for the Pacific Northwest. So, Amy, is this website, the Smart Farms website, a good source of more information, or can you recommend more?
Yeah, so the dry farming, there's some resources on the dry farming demonstration page. The ones related to climate, the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, the acronym is OCCRI, OCCRI. That's where you can find all the climate predictions, and there's a Pacific Northwest Climate Hub here in Corvallis. And so a lot of the resources I've been getting in that way are from them. So Beatrice Van Horn is the person on campus, and Mark Strobel is another one. Those are good contacts there at the Pacific Northwest Climate Hub.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I guess the last couple questions here, there's some people in different regions that are wondering whether they could try dry farming. And I know you were talking earlier that it's really pretty limited where dry farming works well. And I don't know if that's, you know, you did mention the types of soil that are necessary for dry farming. And here's somebody from Arizona who is interested whether it works in the low desert area. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, yeah, probably for dry farming per se, the strict definition of dry farming, it really is a Mediterranean climate cropping system, because we're talking about having 5 or 6 dry months through the main part of the crop season that they're growing. And so it's pretty much a Mediterranean climate phenomena. The thing about Arizona and a lot of like the interior West is they don't have a Mediterranean climate. They have a continental climate, and July and August are monsoonal months, which is exactly an opposite kind of a situation. So probably not, unfortunately, probably not Arizona or New Mexico. I mean, there are things called, well, and Amy mentioned dry land farming, which is actually also something that can happen in Mediterranean, but it can happen in other climates too. That's really just using your natural rainfall instead of, you know, using drip irrigation or flood or overhead.
Rain-fed agriculture.
It's rain-fed agriculture. So that's the difference between dry land farming and dry farming. But I would say that in the world, the Mediterranean climates is where it's going to be pretty well limited, and so it's the West, you know, but the thing is, in terms of rainfall, I've seen it successful down to as low as 12 to 15 inches of rain, so maybe even as far as Southern California, but all the way up to British Columbia.
Mm-hmm. And here in the Willamette Valley, we have more than 40 inches of rainfall, so that's quite a spectrum. I mean, it can work in areas where there's maybe 15 inches, but, you know, here we are in the Willamette Valley with more than 40, so there's a lot of moisture that we get in the winter that can be used for summer crop production if managed properly.
Okay, and I guess one more question. Do these principles apply to perennial crops as well as annual crops, or?
Yeah. I do pomegranates, peaches, pluots, Asian pears, European pears. I would imagine I've seen it done with walnuts and chestnuts. perennials love it. And I think the big deal that I tried to stress was you have to start off with a large root system and a small plant. You can do that completely like I do by pruning, starting the tree off very small. And I've had some really neat results. My friend Fred, who farms across the fence from me, he planted his vineyard after working with me for a while, but he had to crop underneath his plants. So his trees got ultimate fertility and ultimate water, but 4 years down the road, mine are the ones that actually had the sellable crop. In those first 2 or 3 years, my trees were smaller. They weren't as dark green. But then, year 4, year 5, and now we're at year 8, and mine are just have a beautiful crop on mine, and he's still got a spotty crop or no crop at all. So I think it can, perennials work great. And I actually do, I have currant, I have a buffalo currant that I grow, and a number of other small, I've done the, goji berries. I've done goji berries. They take a while to establish, but once they establish, they're good. So there's a number of things. Perennials do very, very well. And the one of the reasons my orchard is on that knoll is because my farm used to be on that knoll, and it was extremely hard to have a low water input farm on that knoll. That soil drained so well. But meanwhile, you would see the old homestead with abandoned apples and walnuts, and they were fine, totally abandoned. The only pruning was the bear. So so now I've put that all into perennials, and I haven't found a perennial that doesn't work.
Okay, great. We're running out of time, but I'd like to thank everyone for submitting those questions. Next week we have a really great webinar coming up with Laura Langnick on climate resilience on organic farms. So I hope very much that you can join us for that. You can find that at the first link on your screen and on the page with all of our upcoming and archived webinars. So thank you so much, Amy, Jacques, Steve, and Bill, for presenting your work today and showing us all those pictures. And thanks to everyone for joining us.